I was pouring my first cup of coffee that Christmas morning when my phone lit up with a name I hadn't seen in years. Charles Marrow. My father. The man who had disappeared from my life the way smoke disappears from a room, quietly leaving nothing but a strange smell and unanswered questions. I stared at the screen, unsure whether to let it ring out. But something inside me, maybe instinct, maybe dread, made me swipe to answer. "How were the chocolates I sent you?" His voice trembled like every word was being dragged out of him. I frowned. "Chocolates? Dad? I don't even like sweets. I gave them to Hannah and the kids last night. They love that stuff." Silence. Not a pause, not a breath, just a suffocating void. Then he screamed. "You did what? Julia, listen to me. Don't let them open that box. Don't let them eat any of it." Before I could respond, my phone vibrated again. Hannah's name flashed. I switched over. Her voice was shattered with panic. Julia Emma just collapsed. She only smelled those chocolates. And then she fainted. The mug slipped from my hand and shattered on the floor. And in a flash, just as sharp, just as cold, the scent of those chocolates hit me. That strange metallic sweetness. The same smell that clung to my mother's hospital room the night she died 18 years ago. Christmas morning wasn't supposed to begin this way. But some curses don't die with time. They wait. I threw on a coat and drove straight to Hannah's neighborhood, passing houses glowing with warm lights and families opening gifts. The normalcy of it all made the panic in my chest feel unreal, like I was trapped behind a window looking at a life that should have been mine. Sirens blared ahead. Red and blue flashes pierced the morning fog. A paramedic was kneeling beside my niece, little Emma, pale and limp on the living room carpet. "What happened?" I asked, kneeling beside her. "We're not sure," the paramedic said. "Her pulse is stabilizing, but she reacted to something she inhaled. Something strong." He lifted the half-open chocolate box. The moment he caught the scent, his nose wrinkled, and his expression tightened into something grim. "This smell. I've only come across it once," he murmured. "At Hearthline Hospital." My stomach dropped. Hearthline. The place where my mother, Margaret Marrow, had taken her last breath. The place that had haunted my nightmares since I was 14. My father's voice echoed in my mind. "Don't trust anyone from that hospital." I swallowed hard and followed the paramedics as they rushed Emma out the door. A cold wind swept through the entryway and brushed against the back of my neck. I turned. A gray SUV was parked across the street. Engine off, windows tinted, watching. I stepped closer for a better look just as the vehicle pulled away in a slow, deliberate glide, as if taunting me. At the hospital, Hannah paced the waiting room like a caged animal. Her husband held her shoulders, trying to keep her upright. "She's awake," a nurse finally said. Weak, but awake. And it wasn't food poisoning. What was it, I asked? "A biological reaction," the nurse replied, "to something inhaled." Her eyes drifted toward the chocolate box I still held in my hands, and for a moment, just a moment, fear flickered across her face. She quickly masked it with professional calm. "You look familiar," she whispered. "I've never met you," I said. "No, not you." "Margaret." My mother's name hit me like a blow. The nurse stepped away before I could ask anything else, disappearing behind a shifting line of curtains. Why did that scent follow me everywhere? Why did strangers keep saying I looked like her? And why did my father sound like a man running from death itself? My phone rang again. "Dad? Is she okay?" he asked, breathless. "She's alive." "Dad, what was in that box?" "It wasn't meant for you," he said. "It was meant for me." I froze. "Why would someone want to hurt you?" His voice cracked. "Because the past is waking up. Because I'm the last one alive who knows what really happened. And they know you're looking too. Looking for what I demanded." He didn't answer. Instead, I heard a soft click like someone else had picked up on the line. Then he whispered, "Julia, I need you to be careful." The line went dead. I stood in the hallway, every sound amplified: the beep of monitors, the shuffle of shoes, the hum of fluorescent lights, each one blending with the ghosts of 18 years. A soft voice behind me made me turn. "You're Margaret's daughter." It was the same older nurse from earlier. Her face was pale, lips trembling. "Ma'am," I said, forcing calm into my voice, "did you know my mother?" She nodded slowly. She was a good nurse, a kind one, and she didn't deserve what happened. "What do you mean?" I stepped closer. Before she could answer, an orderly passed by and she instantly fell silent. Her eyes darted toward him, fear unmistakable and sharp. "When the time comes," she whispered, "you'll understand." Then she hurried away. I stood there, rooted to the tile floor, feeling the past tightening around my throat. As I left the hospital to catch up with Hannah and Emma, a folded note fluttered beneath the wipers of my car. I pulled it free, heart hammering. The handwriting was shaky, jagged, almost frantic. "Stop digging, or you're next." A cold shiver crawled down my spine. The street was quiet. Too quiet. The same gray SUV rolled past the far corner before disappearing around the bend. I looked back at the hospital entrance, its glass doors reflecting the pale winter sun. For a moment in that reflection, I thought I saw a woman with red hair standing just behind me. My mother had red hair. I spun around. No one was there. But one thing had become painfully clear. Someone didn't want me near the truth. And someone else, someone who had been watching long before I ever knew, wanted me to find it. I closed my fist around the threatening note, slid into my car, and drove toward home. Christmas morning had begun with a scream. And now something far older and far darker had finally woken up. I sprinted through the sliding glass doors of Hearthline Hospital with my pulse pounding against my ribs, the cold December air still clinging to my coat as if trying to hold me back. Hospitals always smelled the same, sterile, metallic, and faintly tragic, but this one carried the exact scent I'd prayed I'd never smell again. The scent that had wrapped itself around my mother's deathbed 18 years ago. I followed the sound of Hannah's voice before I even saw her. She was pacing in frantic circles near the pediatric unit, her hands shaking so badly her phone nearly slipped from her grasp. "Julia," she gasped when she saw me. "She's awake. She's okay, but God, Jules. I thought we were losing her." I hugged her tight enough to ground us both, but my eyes drifted past her toward the room where paramedics had taken Emma. The memory of her small body limp on the carpet twisted my stomach until nausea blurred the edges of my vision. "What did they say?" I asked. Hannah swallowed. "They don't know yet. They think she inhaled something toxic. They're running tests." I froze. "Inhaled? Yeah. They said it wasn't food-related at all." The box of chocolates felt heavier in my hands, like something alive, poisonous, waiting. Before I could ask more, a nurse with a soft, round face and graying hair walked toward us. She slowed as soon as her eyes met mine. Something flickered behind her expression. Recognition or fear or both. "You're with the little girl?" she asked, but her gaze stayed fixed on me. "Yes," I said. "She's my niece. Is she stable?" "Yes, for now," the nurse said. She hesitated. "May I ask your name, Julia?" I said. "Julia Marrow." The nurse inhaled sharply, almost imperceptibly, but enough that I felt it like a cold finger running down my spine. "You look exactly like her," she whispered. "Like who?" Her eyes darted around, scanning for someone listening. "Margaret, your mother." My breath hitched. Before I could push further, she stepped back as an orderly walked by. I recognized the shift instantly, the way someone shuts down when they fear being overheard. "I should get back," she murmured, turning away. "Wait," I said, grabbing her sleeve gently. "You knew my mother." Her eyes softened, then clouded with something like sorrow. She was a good woman, and she didn't deserve what happened. What do you mean? But she was already gone, disappearing behind a curtain like a ghost dissolving into thin air. The hospital suddenly felt too bright, too loud, too full of secrets. My phone vibrated in my hand. Dad! I hesitated before answering, still hearing his earlier panic as if it were echoing down these hallways. Is she all right? He asked, breathless. She's stable, I said. But Dad, what was in that box? He exhaled shakily. It wasn't meant for you. You said that. But why? Why would someone want to hurt you? Silence stretched across the line. Then, in a voice so low I had to press the phone hard against my ear, he said, Because the past is waking up. Because I'm the last one alive who knows what really happened. What happened? I demanded. His voice cracked. Julia, I need you to be careful. Before I could say another word, another faint sound crackled on the line. A second connection. A soft click someone had joined the call. Dad. Who's there? I whispered. My father's breath hitched, and then the line went dead. I tried calling back, but it rang once and went straight to voicemail. My pulse stuttered with dread. I shoved the phone into my pocket and walked back toward Emma's room, but every muscle in my body felt wired alert to every shadow, every movement, every breath. The paramedics were finishing their tests when I returned. One of them handed me the chocolate box. Where did this come from? He asked. My father sent it, I said. He sniffed the opened wrapper and grimaced. I've only come across this scent one other time, at Hearthline years ago. Whatever it is, it's not chocolate. His words froze the air between us. Hannah overheard him and grabbed my arm. Julia, what does he mean, I don't know? I said. But I did know. Deep inside, I knew exactly what he meant. The smell wasn't unfamiliar. It was woven into the darkest night of my childhood, the night I sat beside Mom's bed, feeling the wrongness even before the alarms went off. A wave of déjà vu washed over me so strong my knees nearly gave. The nurse returned. Emma's resting now. You can sit with her. I stepped inside the dim room. Emma lay curled beneath a blanket, cheeks pale but breathing steadily. I brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. Aunt Julia, she whispered, eyes barely open. Yeah, sweetheart. I'm right here. She blinked slowly, then said something so soft I almost thought I imagined it. There was a woman here. I stiffened. A woman. She stood by my bed. Emma pointed weakly toward the doorway. She had red hair. My blood ran cold. Red hair. Mom had red hair. I forced myself to breathe. Are you sure, baby? Emma nodded once, drifting back into sleep. I stepped out of the room, leaning against the wall to steady myself. The hallway felt like a tunnel closing in around me. On my way to the parking lot, I texted Hannah to stay with Emma. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hit the keys. When I reached my car, I stopped in my tracks. There was a piece of paper tucked neatly beneath the windshield wiper. My heart hammered as I pulled it free. The message was written in rushed, uneven strokes like the writer's hand shook with adrenaline. Stop digging, or you're next. A cold wind brushed the back of my neck. I whipped around. At the far end of the lot, headlights blinked on. A gray SUV, the same one from earlier. It idled for a moment, just long enough for me to feel its gaze before slipping away into the fog. My breath came in tight, shallow bursts. I climbed into my car and locked the doors, scanning the mirrors again and again. Everything around me seemed suddenly dangerous, the shadows, the lights, the silence. Someone didn't want me looking into my mother's death. Someone wanted to scare me away. And someone else, someone hidden deeper in the folds of the past, wanted me to find the truth. As I drove toward home, the note lay on the passenger seat, its threat sinking into my bones. Stop digging. But something had already started inside me that no threat could bury. I wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not after 18 years of ghosts. I reached the old cafe in Savannah's historic district just after sunrise, the kind of morning where the cold felt sharper than the light. The windows were fogged from the heater inside, glowing gold against the blue-gray dawn. For a moment, I stood outside watching the silhouette of an older woman seated alone in the far corner. She didn't sip her tea. She didn't look at the door. She simply waited, as if she had known the exact second I'd arrive. When I stepped inside, the bell on the door chimed softly. She lifted her head. Her eyes met mine immediately, not with surprise, but with the solemn certainty of someone seeing a prophecy fulfilled. "You walk like her," she said as I approached. "Margaret, your mother." Her voice hit me like someone had opened a window in my chest, letting the cold rush straight in. No one had spoken my mother's name with that kind of tenderness in 18 years. "Are you Evelyn Harrow?" I asked, though I already knew. The woman nodded. Her hands trembled only slightly as she motioned for me to sit. I slid into the booth across from her, my heartbeat drumming so loudly I wondered if she could hear it. "I used to work with your mother," Evelyn said. "She trusted me." And I failed her. I stared at her, unsure how to respond. The guilt on her face looked older than her wrinkles. "She left something behind." Evelyn continued. "Something meant only for you." From the bag beside her feet, she pulled out a worn manila folder sealed with yellowed tape. She placed it between us as though she were laying down evidence of a crime. I hesitated before opening it. Inside were several torn sheets of lined paper, fragile at the edges, the ink faded with time. But the handwriting was unmistakably hers. Neat, deliberate, with the slight rightward tilt I used to imitate as a child. My breath caught. "These are—" I couldn't finish. "They're pages from your mother's diary," Evelyn said softly. "Pages someone ripped out the night she died." My fingers curled around the edges of the first page. Who would tear pages from a dying woman's diary? Who would even know where to find it? The first entry was dated just 2 days before her death. "Someone is watching me." The words were underlined twice. My pulse spiked. "I don't understand," I whispered. Was she paranoid? Or was someone actually— She wasn't imagining it. Evelyn interrupted. "I saw the woman too." A chill slid down my spine. The woman, Evelyn nodded. She stood in the parking lot during night shifts, leaned against her car and stared at the entrance. Sometimes she followed Margaret all the way to her own car. When Margaret confronted her, she didn't speak, just stared with these empty, furious eyes. I swallowed. Who was she? Evelyn hesitated, then reached into the folder and withdrew a small photograph. She placed it in my hand. A woman with hollow cheeks, tired eyes, and dark circles stared back at me. Her grief clung to her like a second skin. Her name was Lorraine Pike, Evelyn said. "That's the LP your mother wrote about." My throat dried. Why would she follow my mother? Because she believed Margaret killed her daughter. The cafe suddenly felt too small, too warm, too suffocating. What I whispered. "A girl died during a night shift," Evelyn said. "A 7-year-old named Marley Pike. Lorraine blamed your mother." "But Margaret, she tried to save that child. She tried so hard." The words punched through me. I looked down at the diary pages, hands trembling. The next entry was messier, as if written in panic. Equipment malfunction. Medication misplaced. Something isn't right. If anything happens to me, tell Julia about LP. My name written in my mother's hand almost sent me reeling. She knew something, I said. Something bigger than a child's death. "She did," Evelyn replied, eyes glossy. "And those who caused it knew she knew." I studied the lines again, noticing for the first time the way the ink had bled slightly near the bottom, as if a drop of water or a tear had fallen on it. "When did you get these?" I asked. "Years ago. Margaret gave me a key to her locker 3 days before she died. I didn't know what I'd find. I didn't know I'd find pages missing from her diary months later." Evelyn's voice cracked. I kept them hidden because I was terrified. But you should have them. What made you reach out now? I asked. Evelyn looked over my shoulder toward the fogged window. Because someone else came looking before you. Another chill deeper than the first slid up my spine. What do you mean, a man came to my door 10 days ago? She whispered. He said he was an old friend of Margaret's, but he asked questions only someone from the hospital's administrative office would know. Questions about that night, about who was on shift, about you, about me, I breathed. He wanted to know where you lived. The room swayed before my eyes. What did you tell him? I asked, voice barely stable. Nothing, Evelyn said firmly. I lied. I said I hadn't seen you since you were a girl. But the way he looked at me, Julia, like he knew I was lying, that's when I decided I couldn't keep these pages from you anymore. My eyes drifted back to the diary pages. Someone is watching me. Tell Julia. They warned me. This wasn't an accident. It felt as though every word was reaching across 18 years to grip me by the throat. Why, my mother? I whispered. Why follow her? Why threaten her? Evelyn's eyes softened with pity. Your mother wanted justice. She wanted the truth about that little girl's death. But the truth was buried by someone very powerful. Someone who wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who dug too deep. I thought of the SUV that kept following me, of the nurse who recognized me, of the Christmas box, of Emma's near death. And they think I'm digging now, I murmured. Evelyn leaned closer. You need to be careful. You're stepping into the same shadows Margaret stepped into. Shadows that swallowed her whole. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but a sudden clatter from the next booth made us both jump. A spoon had fallen off a saucer, landing on the wooden floor. The table was empty. There was no one sitting there, Evelyn murmured, frowning. A flicker of movement outside caught my eye. Through the cafe window, I saw the same gray SUV parked across the street. The driver sat still, face hidden behind tinted glass, watching. I tensed. Evelyn followed my gaze and stiffened. That's the car, she whispered. A surge of adrenaline shot through me. I grabbed the folder and stood. I have to go. Wait. Evelyn grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. There's one more thing. From her coat pocket, she drew a thick envelope sealed with dark red wax. The surface was rough, embossed slightly with age. Just 2 words were written on the front in my mother's handwriting. For Julia. My breath stalled in my lungs. Evelyn pressed it into my hands. Your mother wanted you to have this, only when your life started to look like hers did. I stared at the envelope, heart beating so hard it almost hurt. And does it? Evelyn's answer came in barely more than a whisper. Yes. Outside the SUV, engine rumbled to life. I backed away, envelope in hand, diary pages pressed to my chest. The cafe door chimed again as I slipped out into the cold air. The SUV idled long enough to let me know it had seen me. And then it pulled away. I stood frozen for several seconds before finally forcing myself toward my car. My mother had been hunted. Now I was being watched. And for the first time in 18 years, I understood why she had written my name among the last words she ever penned. The truth hadn't died with her. It had waited for me. I didn't remember the drive home. One moment I was leaving the cafe with my mother's torn diary pages pressed against my chest, and the next I was standing in my kitchen staring at the red wax envelope as if it might burn my hands. The house was silent, too still, like breath held in the dark. I set the envelope on the table, but the sight of it made my pulse race. I paced the room, replaying Evelyn's words. Your mother wanted you to have this only when your life started to look like hers did. What did that mean? Fear, threats, being watched. The answer came with a sudden knock that made me flinch so violently I nearly dropped my phone. 3 short raps, a pause, then 2 more. I forced myself toward the door and peeked through the side window. Tom Richardson stood on my porch bundled in a light jacket that wasn't nearly warm enough for December. His shoulders hunched against the cold hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked older than his 60-something years' worry carved into the lines of his face. I opened the door. "Tom, what are you doing here?" His eyes darted to the driveway, to the street, to the shadows between the yards. "We need to talk," he whispered. "Right now. About what your mother." The way he said it, quiet, urgent, terrified, made every nerve in my body tighten. I stepped aside and he slipped into the house like someone slipping into church to confess. As soon as the door shut, he exhaled shakily. "I shouldn't be here. But after seeing that SUV out front last night..." "Julia, they're watching you the same way they watched your mother." I didn't ask who they were. I already knew the answer was tangled somewhere in Hearthline Hospital. Tom rubbed his hands together, trying to warm them. "I knew your mom. Not well, but enough. She was one of the best nurses we had. Smart, brave, too brave." He looked at me then, and the pity in his eyes made my stomach twist. "She died because she wouldn't stay quiet." A cold shudder ran through me. "Quiet about what?" "About what happened to that little girl." His voice cracked. "About how the records were altered. About how someone switched her medication dosage the night she died." I swallowed hard. "Who did it?" Tom hesitated. His jaw clenched. His gaze dropped to the floor. "The same man who nearly ended up killing your mother." Before I could press him, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper. "This is what I came to give you," he said, handing it to me. I kept it all these years. I unfolded the paper carefully. A handwritten evening roster. Nurses, staff on call. One name circled in red pen. Dr. Rowan Hale, attending physician. My breath stalled. He was there. "He was always there," Tom whispered. "Even when he wasn't supposed to be." Before I could speak, headlights flashed across the living room wall. Both of us turned sharply. A gray SUV rolled down the street, slowing as it reached my driveway. My throat closed. Tom grabbed my arm. "We have to move. Now." I crossed to the window, watching the SUV glide to a stop. The engine idled, exhaust rising in pale streams. A dark silhouette sat behind the wheel. "He followed me," Tom muttered. I knew he would. I tugged him toward the back door. "Let's go out through the yard." But before we could take a step, there was a crack like stone hitting pavement. Tom yanked me down just as something smashed through the front window, scattering glass across the hardwood. "Get down," he hissed. We crawled behind the sofa, breath shallow. My heart hammered in my throat as I peeked through the shattered window's frame. The SUV door had opened. A tall man stepped out, his figure obscured by the glare of the street lamp. He wore a long coat, dark, heavy. The wind caught the edges of it, snapping it like a flag. "Who is that?" I whispered. Tom didn't answer. His silence was answer enough. He grabbed my wrist. "Julia, listen. You can't stay here. You're already in too deep." "What does he want?" "He wants to finish what he started," Tom whispered. "And he won't stop this time." Before I could speak, another sound split the air. Footsteps, fast, coming around the side of the house. Tom's eyes went wide. "Run!" I didn't think. I just grabbed the diary pages, shoved them into my coat, and bolted through the kitchen toward the back door. Tom followed close behind, but as he reached the threshold, a shadow blocked the exit. The same shadow I'd seen in the hospital reflection. In the parking lot. Watching. The figure lunged. Tom shouted, "Go, Julia! Go!" I stumbled back, watching in horror as Tom swung blindly and missed. The figure grabbed him by the collar and slammed him into the wooden deck rail. The wood cracked under the force. "Stop!" I screamed. But the figure didn't stop. Tom choked, gasping for breath. The attacker's arm was braced across his throat, pinning him hard. "Let him go," I shouted, but my voice shook. The figure didn't speak, didn't look at me, didn't react at all. Something cold and primal coiled inside my chest. I grabbed the nearest thing within reach, an old garden shovel leaning against the siding, and swung. It connected with a dull thud against the attacker's back. He flinched only slightly. But it was enough. Tom slid from his grip, wheezing body shaking violently. The attacker turned toward me, and for the first time I saw his face half lit by the porch light. Sharp features, cold eyes that looked like they'd memorized every fear I'd ever had. I froze. He didn't come closer. He didn't need to. His voice was low, gravelly, deliberate. "Stop digging." Then he stepped back into the shadows, disappearing between the houses with terrifying ease. The gray SUV peeled around the corner seconds later, tires hissing. For a long moment, all I heard was my own pulse. Tom collapsed onto the deck, coughing. I rushed to him, helping him sit upright. "We need the police," I whispered. "No." Tom gasped. "They can't protect you from him. They never could." My hands trembled as I held him. "Tom, who was that? Tell me." He looked up at me with wet, terrified eyes. "That was Dr. Rowan Hale." The world tilted. "He's not just dangerous," Julia, Tom added with effort. "He's connected, untouchable. And your mother." She almost exposed him. I swallowed the knot in my throat. "And he killed her." Tom shook his head weakly. "No. She died from fear exhaustion, and knowing no one would believe her. But he made sure the truth never reached daylight." Tears blurred my vision. Tom squeezed my hand. "You have to find the rest of her diary. And whatever's in that red envelope. It's the only protection you have." The winter wind howled through the broken window behind us, scattering glass across the floor like tiny stars. My house was no longer safe. My city wasn't safe. And the truth, whatever pieces of it my mother left behind, had just painted a target on my back. As I helped Tom to his feet, I felt the weight of the red wax envelope against my chest. My mother hadn't left it for curiosity. She had left it for survival. And as the sky turned a pale winter gray, one thought rooted deeper than fear. If Dr. Rowan Hale wanted me to stop digging, I had no choice but to dig deeper. I drove Tom to the hospital in silence, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, the smell of cold December air mixing with the metallic tang of blood from the cut above his eyebrow. He kept insisting he was fine, but the way he struggled to breathe, each inhale sharp and ragged, told a different story. Every time he winced, guilt twisted in my chest. I should have stopped the attack sooner. I should have known something worse was coming. When we reached the ER entrance, a nurse rushed out with a wheelchair. Tom tried to wave her off, but his legs nearly gave, and she forced him into the seat with a firm, practiced grip. "Ma'am, we need you to stay in the waiting area," the nurse instructed me. I nodded, watching them disappear behind a curtain. My reflection in the glass sliding doors looked like a stranger hair-disheveled coat askew, eyes wide and haunted. I sank into a plastic chair and buried my face in my hands. My phone buzzed on my lap. Unknown number. For a moment, I almost didn't answer. Then I forced myself to pick up. A woman's whisper hissed through the speaker. "You should have listened." I sat bolt upright. Who is this silence? Then a long exhale. Margaret didn't listen either. I froze, breath locked in my throat. "Leave Savannah." "Julia," the voice murmured. "Leave before they decide you're not worth warning." The line went dead. My fingers were trembling when I set the phone down. I looked around the waiting room, scanning faces, corners, windows. But no one looked out of place. No one looked like a threat. No one looked like they were staring back. Yet I felt watched. Every inhale grew tighter, like invisible hands were wrapping around my throat. I had to move. I had to do something, anything, or I would lose my mind. A doctor in blue scrubs approached 10 minutes later. "Are you with Mr. Richardson?" "Yes. Is he all right?" "He's stable. But he sustained a severe contusion and signs of strangulation. Someone knew what they were doing." "Can I see him?" He hesitated. Briefly. I followed him into a dim room where Tom lay hooked to monitors. His throat was bruised, fingerprints blooming across the skin like ink stains. "Julia," he rasped when he saw me. "Don't talk," I said gently. He shook his head. "We don't have much time." I stepped closer, pulling a chair beside his bed. "Tom, I'm not going anywhere. Tell me what you meant earlier about my mother, about Hale." He stared past me, eyes unfocused, as if he were looking through years of regret. "Your mother wasn't paranoid," he whispered. "She wasn't imagining shadows. She was followed, just like you are." My blood ran cold. Hale blamed her for what happened to Marley. "Pike," Tom continued, "but she wasn't at fault. She was the only one who tried to save that child." "Then why did Lorraine blame her?" I asked. "Because Hale needed someone to point the finger at. He couldn't afford a scandal. Not then, not with the funding he was chasing from the research board." "What research?" I asked. Tom closed his eyes briefly. "The hospital was under investigation for mismanaged medications. Hale altered logs, erased orders. And when that little girl died, he panicked. He coughed, wincing. I leaned forward. Tom, who else was involved? Who helped him?" "There's a second person, someone in that SUV." Tom's eyes flicked open. Fear trembled in their depths. "There was a technician," he whispered. "A quiet man, always in the shadows. He had access to everything supplies storage camera systems. He did whatever Hale told him." "What was his name?" Tom swallowed painfully. "I don't remember. We called him the Ghost." The hairs on my arms lifted. "Julia," Tom said weakly, "listen to me. Hale and that man, they'll do anything to protect their secrets. You need to get out. Tonight." Before I could answer, alarms on the monitor beeped rapidly. A nurse rushed in, followed by another doctor. They gently pushed me aside. "You need to step out, ma'am." I backed out of the room, heart pounding, watching as nurses worked to stabilize him. The door closed in my face. I wandered down the hallway past rows of dim rooms and quiet monitors, trying to steady my breathing. The smell, sterile antiseptic, was the same smell that clung to my mother's hospital gown the night she died. A memory slipped through the cracks. Standing in the doorway at 14, watching machines blink while my mother gripped my hand and whispered, "Don't be afraid of the truth, Julia. Be afraid of those who bury it." I pressed my hand to my chest, feeling the thrum of my heartbeat beneath my palm. Evelyn. The diary pages. The envelope. Tom's confession. The SUV. All threads of the same web, and every thread led back to one place. Hearthline Hospital. I walked toward the restricted wing. The sign said, "Staff only," but the badge reader was malfunctioning. It blinked yellow instead of red. I hesitated, then slid through the door the moment a nurse exited. The hallway beyond was colder, quieter. Fluorescent lights buzzed like angry insects overhead. I passed old filing cabinets, equipment rooms, and shelves full of outdated charts. At the end of the hall, a storage door stood slightly ajar. I pushed it open. Inside were rows of boxes stacked floor to ceiling. Some had been chewed by dust or time, but one marked in faded ink caught my eye. Marrow M. Incident file archived. My heart slammed against my ribs. I pulled the box down, wiping dust from the lid. Inside were a medication chart, a broken syringe cap, an incident report with my mother's name forged in a handwriting that wasn't hers, a shift rotation ledger, and buried at the bottom a small photograph. I lifted it out carefully. My mother stood in the picture, smiling faintly, holding the hand of a little girl with curly brown hair. "Marley," I breathed. The picture was dated 2 days before Marley died. I sat on the cold storage room floor as the weight of the image settled over me like a blanket soaked in ice. My mother hadn't been negligent. She hadn't been careless. She had cared. enough to get herself killed. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. I tensed, rising to my feet. The steps were slow, heavy, deliberate. I pressed myself against the shelving unit and peered through the crack of the door. A figure walked past. Tall, broad shoulders, black coat. He moved like he owned the silence. "Hail!" My lungs froze. He stopped in the middle of the hallway and turned his head, listening. I held my breath so long my vision blurred. After a long moment, he moved again, heading toward the exit. The sound of his footsteps faded like a retreating storm. I didn't move until the buzzing lights hummed back into dominance. When I finally slipped out of the room, I held the edges of the box tight against my chest, ignoring the tremble in my hands. Somewhere deeper inside this hospital, ghosts of the past walked freely. And now I knew one thing with terrifying clarity. To understand how my mother died, I had to follow those ghosts, even if one of them was still alive. I took one last look at the storage door before walking away. The truth wasn't buried. It was still bleeding. I sat in the glow of the street lamp outside Tom's hospital room, my hands still trembling from the sight of him being wheeled away on a stretcher. The bruises on his neck had been shaped like fingers, deliberate, controlled, efficient. Whoever attacked him wasn't some impulsive criminal. He knew exactly how to silence someone. He'd tried to silence my mother. And now he had tried to silence Tom. The doctor stepped out a few minutes later. He survived by an inch, he said. If the pressure on his trachea had lasted another few seconds. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. I thanked him and walked to the main corridor where fluorescent lights hummed overhead and shadows clung to corners like dark memories. A security officer approached me holding a clipboard. "Miss Marrow, we'd like to take your statement about what happened." I followed him to a small office. The walls were painted an uninviting beige, the kind that feels both sterile and suffocating. He asked for details, what I'd seen, what Tom told me the description of the attacker. He was tall, I said, broad shoulders, moved like he had military training. My throat tightened. He didn't speak, not a word. The officer scribbled notes, then asked, "Did you see the attacker's face?" "Yes," I said, "but only for a moment. Could you identify him again?" A cold rush traveled through my veins. "I think so." He slid a form across the desk. "We also checked the nearest traffic camera near your home. It was disabled minutes before the attack. Someone erased the footage." Every muscle in my body stiffened. That wasn't normal. That was planned, deliberate, professional. When the officer dismissed me, I walked the halls again, feeling the weight of someone's eyes on me. Every nurse who passed seemed wary. Every orderly who glanced my way held their stare a split second too long. My instinct screamed that I wasn't safe here, but Tom was still fighting upstairs. I needed to stay. I needed answers. I went to the ICU expecting to be allowed in. But a new nurse stood guard, her expression tense. "I'm sorry," she said. "Only immediate family for now." "I'm the one who brought him here." "Orders from upstairs," she interrupted. "We're trying to keep the room secure after what happened." The phrasing made my stomach twist. "He's still in danger." She hesitated long enough to confirm everything I feared. "We're doing everything we can." I backed away slowly, gripping the handrail to steady myself. Upstairs, machines beeped around Tom like frantic reminders of mortality. And somewhere in this building was the man who wanted him dead. I left the ICU and headed toward the cafeteria to call Hannah. As I walked down the stairwell, I caught a flicker of movement behind me. A figure. Long coat. Gray fabric. I froze. I slowly turned. The space was empty. But when I turned again, the hair on the back of my neck stood straight. Someone was following me. I reached the cafeteria doors just as my phone buzzed. A text popped up. Unknown number. Stop chasing the past. A second message came immediately. Or you'll end like her. My mother. My lungs locked. My fingers shook around the phone. I looked around the brightly lit cafeteria, expecting to see someone watching from a corner table. But everything looked deceptively normal: parents with coffee nurses on break, a vending machine humming in the corner. But then I saw him. Standing near the emergency exit. Tall, gray coat, face half hidden beneath a pulled-down cap. He wasn't eating, wasn't talking to anyone. He was staring straight at me. The moment our eyes met, he stepped toward the exit door and disappeared into the stairwell. I didn't follow. I was terrified to, but I couldn't run forever. I needed to think. I found an empty hallway outside the cafeteria and dialed Hannah. When she answered, her voice was strained with worry. "Jules, is everything okay?" "I don't know," I whispered. "Tom was attacked, badly. He survived, but, Hannah, I think someone tried to kill him because he told me too much." "Oh my God," she breathed. "Do you think it's connected to what happened to Mom?" "I don't think," I whispered. "I know." A heavy silence filled the line. "What are you going to do?" she asked. I stared at the white hallway tiles my reflection cast faintly in their polished surface. I could see the fear in my own eyes, the uncertainty, but beneath it all the same stubborn fire I had seen in my mother's face in old photos. "I'm going to find out the truth," I said. "Julia, please be careful," Hannah whispered. "Whatever this is, it's been buried for a reason." Before I could respond, the line crackled. A faint clicking noise echoed on the call. Someone else had joined the line. "Hannah," I said. "Are you still there?" Static. Then a breath slow, controlled, just like before. I hung up immediately, heart slamming. They were listening. I couldn't stay at the hospital any longer. I walked out into the cold night, the air slicing through my coat. The parking lot was dimly lit, empty except for a few scattered cars. As I approached mine, I saw something tucked under the windshield wiper. Another note. I snatched it off with trembling fingers. "You're walking in her footsteps. Turn back now." My breath clouded in front of me, shaky and uneven. I looked around the lot. A gray SUV sat near the far exit engine, idling. Its headlights flashed once, slow and deliberate, before the vehicle rolled out of sight. I threw the note into my car and got in, locking the doors. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I stared straight ahead, forcing myself to think rationally. But the truth was swallowing me whole. Someone inside that hospital didn't want the truth resurfacing. Someone outside was watching me, waiting for a chance to end what my mother had started. And somewhere in Savannah, a silent figure had been in my house, walking across my floors, watching me sleep. When I got home again, I paused at the door, listening. Silence. But silence didn't mean safety. I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me. My house looked untouched, clean, warm, familiar. But I felt that same cold disturbance in the air as before. On the table, the red wax envelope lay open beside the box of evidence. My mother's handwriting seemed to glow in the dim light. I sat, pulling the pages toward me again. "Someone is watching me. Tell Julia. They warned me. This wasn't an accident." My eyes caught something scribbled on the back of one page that I hadn't noticed before. "Faded, almost erased Hale isn't alone." There's another. The silent one. A shiver crawled across my skin. The gray SUV, the footsteps in the stairwell, the open window in my house, the ghost. My mother had feared him too. I stood abruptly, pacing the room as the pieces fell into place. Everything pointed to a larger conspiracy, one that involved more than a single man. Someone else had the power to erase records, disable cameras, follow me without being seen. Someone unseen, unspoken. The ghost. If I wanted answers, I needed to find the rest of my mother's diary. I needed to follow the trail she left, every hint, every fear, every warning. And then I heard it. A soft creak in the hallway behind me. I spun fast, heart leaping. Nothing. But then, Just as I turned back toward the table, I saw it again. The faintest movement. A shadow slipping away. Not seen, but felt. I backed up slowly, gripping the table edge to steady myself. My mother hadn't died of a stroke. She had died running out of time. And tonight I felt it breathing down my neck. I wasn't just uncovering the past. I was being hunted by it. I drove through the night as if the darkness were a tide threatening to swallow me whole. The road from Savannah to Charleston was nearly empty, the kind of lonely stretch where headlights carved out a fragile bubble of safety that could vanish at any moment. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting the gray SUV to appear behind me. Every pair of approaching headlights sent a spike of panic through my chest, but none of them followed long enough to be him. By the time Charleston's harbor lights shimmered into view, dawn was beginning to paint a pale bruise along the horizon. I parked outside Heritage Vault, the old stone bank my mother had visited in the months before she died. The building looked nothing like a bank. It was more like a fortress fortified against time and truth alike. A thick fog drifted between the street lamps, wrapping everything in a heavy, ghost-like stillness. I climbed the steps with shaking hands and pushed open the glass door. The warmth inside hit me like a wave, thick with the scent of paper ink and something metallic. I approached the marble counter where a clerk, a middle-aged man with thinning hair, sorted through a stack of forms. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked politely. I handed him the key. "I'm here to access a safety deposit box, number 123K. He took the key, glanced at it, then at me. Something in his expression shifted, the faint tightening of his mouth, the subtle narrowing of his eyes. "You're Margaret's daughter." The way he said it left no room for misinterpretation. Not a question, a recognition. "Yes," I said cautiously. "She came here often, especially near the end." My pulse quickened. Did she say why? His expression hardened as if he realized he'd said too much. "Please follow me." He led me down a long corridor toward a vault door that looked like it belonged in a museum, massive, circular, solid steel. He unlocked it with a series of codes and keys before escorting me inside. "Room 3, he said, pointing to a narrow viewing booth. The air inside the vault felt colder, quieter, weighted. He inserted my key into a metal drawer labeled 123K and slid it out, placing the long box on the table. "Take as long as you need." The moment he left, the silence grew dense enough to hear my own heartbeat. I lifted the lid. The contents were sparse, but devastating. A sealed envelope with red wax identical to the one found at home. A small flash drive. Several folded sheets of my mother's handwriting. A tiny silver key. And a note that simply said, "If something happens to me, trust Evelyn." I swallowed hard, tears pricking at the back of my eyes. My mother had prepared for something. Something she'd known was coming. I opened the folded papers. Her handwriting leapt from the page like a living thing. "He won't stop. He knows what I saw." Rowan Hale was in the room before Marley died. The dosage was wrong. He changed the log. My breath hitched. The cameras were tampered with. The signature on the incident report isn't mine. Someone forged it. Someone high up. A tremble passed through my fingers. They're watching me. Someone else is helping him. The ghost. Protect Julia. My throat tightened painfully as I read the final line. Locker, chapel. Only if she's ready. Locker, chapel. The small silver key glinted like it understood its purpose. I wiped my eyes and reached for the flash drive. There was a small security computer in the booth. My hand hovered over the port before sliding the drive in. The screen flickered, then a video began. My mother appeared exhausted, disheveled eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. The wavering fluorescent light behind her made her look fragile, almost translucent. "If you're seeing this," she said, voice trembling, "something happened to me." Tears slid silently down my cheeks. "I'm not crazy. I'm not imagining things. Hale knows I'm onto him. I saw him switch the medication. I saw him with the technician they call the ghost. They threatened me, but I won't stop." Her voice broke. She looked over her shoulder as though expecting someone to burst through the door. "Julia, forgive me. I tried. I really tried." The screen distorted violently, then cut to black. My breath came out in a shaking exhale. The silence afterward was so crushing that I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. My mother hadn't died of paranoia. She had died because she was right. I collected the items and stepped out of the booth, but stopped cold. The lights in the vault were flickering. Once. Twice. Then steady. The clerk was nowhere in sight. My instincts screamed at me. Something was wrong. I walked into the hallway, glancing over my shoulder as my footsteps echoed. When I reached the lobby, I scanned the room, heart pounding. That was when I saw him. Standing near the far wall, half hidden by a potted plant, was a tall man in a gray cap, coat to the knees, shoulders stiff, staring at me. My lungs froze mid-inhale. He took a step forward, then stopped. Another step. My pulse thundered. I turned sharply toward the exit. The clerk who had mysteriously vanished before reappeared behind the counter, giving me a startled look. But I didn't stop. I didn't breathe. I didn't look back. Once outside, I practically ran down the steps just in time to see a familiar gray SUV parked across the street behind a row of cars. Someone sat behind the wheel, watching. I moved quickly to my car, unlocking it with shaking fingers. I slid inside, locked the doors, and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. Then I saw it. A piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. I reached through the cracked window to grab it. Only 3 words were written on it. "You opened it." I lifted my gaze. The SUV's headlights blinked once. Fury and terror crashed over me in equal measure. I shoved the note into my coat and drove off, turning sharply onto the main road. My breathing came in ragged bursts as I checked my mirrors. No SUV followed. But the lack of pursuit was somehow worse. Because it meant one thing: he knew where I was going next. On the drive back toward the city, the memory of the silver key weighed heavily on my mind. Locker, chapel, old Mariner's Chapel, a place my mother feared, a place she mentioned in her diary, a place Evelyn had warned me about. And now the key in my pocket pulsed with meaning, as if alive with my mother's final intention. I pulled over to the side of the road and turned off the engine. My hands were trembling harder now, the adrenaline wearing thin. The sky outside had turned stormy clouds, rolling low over Charleston like bruises. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the key. It was small, silver, unassuming. Yet it felt heavier than the flash drive or the diary pages. A small tag dangled from the ring, stained by time. Old Mariner's Chapel, Storage 7. Storage. Not sanctuary. Whatever she hid there wasn't spiritual. It was evidence. The kind of evidence someone like Hale would kill for. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the marshes and palm shadows along the roadside. I started the engine again, the decision forming with terrifying clarity. I would go to the chapel. I had to. If my mother had risked her life to leave something for me, I couldn't turn away. But as I shifted into drive, my phone buzzed. A new message. Unknown number. "We know where you're going." For several long seconds, I stared at the glowing screen, frozen by the truth in those words. Someone had been watching me every step of the way. Someone knew the route before I took it. Someone wanted me to find what my mother left behind, or wanted to stop me just as I reached for it. Either way, the path ahead wasn't just dangerous. It was the last road my mother ever walked. And now, it was mine. The old chapel stood at the edge of Charleston's historic district, like a forgotten relic swallowed by the mist creeping in from the harbor. Lantern-style streetlights flickered along the narrow path leading to its doors, casting long shadows across the weather-worn stones. I parked beneath an ancient oak whose branches twisted overhead like the arms of something guarding the place. The building ahead was small, wooden, and aging, not abandoned, but clearly neglected. The kind of place people walked past without noticing. The kind of place someone might choose to hide a secret. I tightened my grip on the silver key and approached the entrance. The fog swirled around the chapel steps, cushioning each footfall. When I reached the doorway, I hesitated. The wood bore faint scorch marks, old but unmistakable. A sudden breeze swept past, carrying the faint scent of burning. My heart skipped. I touched the doorknob. It turned on its own. The door creaked open, letting out a groan that echoed through the empty sanctuary. My breath shivered in my chest. I stepped inside. The chapel smelled of old wood, extinguished candles, and something faintly metallic. Something familiar. The interior was dim, lit only by the weak daylight filtering through stained glass windows cracked with age. Dust floated lazily in the beams of light. Rows of wooden pews stretched before me, coated with a thin layer of grime, like a second skin, and someone was sitting in the far corner. I froze. A woman hunched, head bowed. Her hair was a deep chestnut streaked with gray. She didn't move until I took a cautious step forward. Then she lifted her head, revealing eyes that looked like they'd cried more tears than they had years left to live. "You look just like her," the woman said, her voice brittle. "Margaret." My pulse jumped. "Are you Lorraine Pike?" She nodded slowly. Her presence hit me hard. This was the woman Evelyn had described. The woman in the photograph. The woman who had haunted my mother's final days. She looked smaller in person, fragile, nothing like the looming threat my mother had written about. I approached cautiously. "I didn't expect to find you here." She let out a hollow laugh. "No one expects to find the broken in God's house. But the broken always return." Her eyes scanned me, lingering on my trembling hands. "You have her strength, her stubbornness, and her fear." I swallowed. "I'm not afraid." Lorraine tilted her head. "Then you haven't seen what I've seen." Her words chilled me. I sat on the pew across from her. I read the reports, the medication logs, the fake signature. My mother wasn't responsible for Marley's death. "No," Lorraine whispered, gripping her coat tightly. "She wasn't. But I didn't know that until it was too late." "Why did you follow her?" I asked. "Why did you frighten her?" A tear rolled down her cheek, carving a lonely line down her aged skin. "Because I loved my daughter more than I loved truth. I wanted someone to blame, someone to punish, someone to hate." She clasped her shaking hands. "And they told me your mother was responsible. They told me she was negligent. Hale told me." I felt my heart sink. Hale Lorraine nodded again. "Dr. Rowan Hale, Marley's attending physician, the one who tried his best to save her. He told me your mother gave the wrong dosage. He showed me falsified records. And I believed him." Her voice cracked like thin ice. "It was easier to hate your mother than to face the corruption eating that hospital from the inside." I exhaled, shakily, anger mixing with grief. She wasn't negligent. She died trying to expose him. "I know," Lorraine whispered. "I know now. But back then, I was blind. Hale fed me lies. He fed everyone lies. He's a monster, Julia. A monster in a white coat." Her words struck a painful chord. "What happened to you?" I asked softly. Lorraine looked at me with a haunted expression. "After Marley died, I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I followed your mother because she was the only thread I had. I thought if I watched her, I'd understand. But all I saw was fear. And then one night, I saw him watching her too. My breath caught. The ghost. Her eyes widened with recognition. Yes, that's what Margaret called him. The silent one. He was always a few paces behind. I saw him outside her home, outside the hospital, watching, listening, waiting. The air around us chilled. "What did he want?" I whispered. "Control," she said, "and compliance. Anyone who questioned Hale became his target." "Your mother." A nurse named Angela before her. And me. My stomach twisted. You... I confronted Hale once, Lorraine said in a hollow voice. I told him I didn't believe his story anymore. The next day, I found a dead pet on my porch. My phone was tapped. My employer received an anonymous complaint and fired me. She shook her head. He ruins people quietly, efficiently, just like he kills. Lightning cracked across the sky outside, illuminating the chapel. Lorraine flinched. I stood sensing the conversation shifting into something deeper. I came here for something my mother left, I said. A storage locker, number 7. Lorraine nodded slowly. Follow me. She led me through the side aisle toward a small door behind the pulpit. She unlocked it with a rusted key and motioned me inside. A narrow staircase descended into a basement that smelled of damp stone and long-forgotten secrets. Each step creaked beneath our weight. At the bottom was a small room with brick walls and a single metal cabinet. Lorraine opened the cabinet, revealing a row of old storage boxes. One was labeled with a 7 etched crudely on its lid. I pulled it out. My fingers trembled as I lifted the top. Inside was a stack of documents and a leather-bound notebook, the rest of my mother's diary. Beneath it were several photographs, including one that made my blood run cold. A picture of Dr. Rowan Hale standing outside my family home, his expression blank, his posture relaxed as if he belonged there. The photograph was dated 2 days before my mother died. I stared at it, my chest tightening. He was there. At my house. Lorraine swallowed. He wanted to scare her. He wanted her silence. I pulled out the diary, flipping through pages filled with my mother's careful handwriting. Some pages were frantic, others meticulous, all of them documenting her fear, her discoveries, her determination. Then something hit the door upstairs. A hollow, thunderous bang. Lorraine stiffened. He's here. My pulse exploded into panic. Who? Another bang. This one louder. The lights flickered. Lorraine grabbed my arm. We need to go. Now. We scrambled up the stairs. I clutched the diary and box against me like a lifeline. At the top, the chapel was dark except for the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the stained glass windows. And then, I saw him. A silhouette framed in the doorway. Tall, still, watching. Lorraine let out a strangled cry. It's him! He stepped forward. The wind howled, slamming the door shut behind him. The chapel plunged into darkness. In the instant before the lights went out completely, I saw the flash of something metallic in his hand. Not a weapon, a lighter. The faint click echoed through the wooden sanctuary. A flame sparked. He tossed it onto the old rug near the aisle. Within seconds, fire bloomed like a living thing, hungry, eager, deadly. Lorraine grabbed my wrist. He's going to burn it. He always said he would burn the truth. Smoke filled the air as we stumbled backward, the fire-consuming pews climbing toward the rafters. I tightened my grip on the diary. My mother had died for this truth. I wasn't going to die without hearing it all. We ran toward the back exit, flames licking at our heels, the chapel turning into a pyre of secrets behind us. But as we reached the door, I heard footsteps behind us. Slow, deliberate. I turned just in time to see the silhouette vanish from view. He wasn't gone. He was waiting. Flames crawled up the wooden beams like hungry fingers swallowing the chapel in a roar of crackling heat. Smoke thickened the air, curling around my legs and clawing at my lungs. Lorraine clutched my arm as we stumbled through the haze, her coughs breaking into ragged sobs. I pushed her forward, searching for a clear path, but every doorway, every aisle, every hiding place was being consumed. Behind us, the fire spread across the floorboards in a violent sweep, chasing us toward the back of the sanctuary. And then, through the wavering orange glow, a silhouette emerged. Tall, still, watching. He stepped out of the smoke with the calmness of a man strolling through a memory. Rowan Hale, the monster my mother had feared, the man who had hunted Tom, the shadow in every hospital hallway. His gray coat flicked with ash, his expression as impassive as a statue carved from bone. "You're just like her," he said softly, almost fondly, always running toward the truth instead of away from it. Lorraine's fingers dug into my sleeve. "He killed my daughter," she whispered, voice breaking. Hale's eyes slid toward her. "Your daughter died because of a clerical error," he said with dismissive ease. "Tragic, but hardly unusual." "You switched her medication," I said sharply, "and you altered the logs, and when my mother tried to expose you—" "You know," he interrupted, tilting his head slightly. I hoped she stayed quiet. I even warned her. I asked her to let it go. But some people don't understand the value of silence. The flames reflected in his eyes, giving them a hellish shine. "You threatened her," I said. "You cornered her in the supply room." He smiled faintly. She was terrified. But brave. I respected that. Respected, I spat. "Yes," he murmured, "enough to give her a chance." But she wouldn't listen. And now here you are carrying her stubbornness like a badge. The smoke made my eyes water, but I kept them fixed on him. Why burn all this? Why set the chapel on fire? He shrugged lightly. "Fire purifies. It simplifies. It erases." My heart pounded. "You forged her signature." "Yes. You tampered with the cameras." He nodded. "Of course. You tried to kill Tom." A brief pause. He was in the wrong place, helping the wrong person. Lorraine lunged forward with a strangled cry, but I held her back. Hale didn't flinch. He looked at her almost pityingly. "You were always so malleable," he said. "So easy to convince. All I had to do was point you toward Margaret, and you did the rest." Lorraine collapsed into tears. "You told me she killed my Marley. You looked me in the eye and said it, and you believed it," he replied, "because you wanted to." A board cracked overhead, showering sparks across the floor. The heat intensified, forcing us to move back. Hale, however, didn't budge. He stood in the center of the burning church like he was immune to the flames licking the air around him. "You know," he said, his voice almost conversational, "the hardest part was keeping the technician quiet. The one Margaret called the ghost. He was sloppy, nervous. I had to take care of him too." My stomach twisted. "Take care of him how?" He smiled again. "How do you think?" Lorraine gasped. "You murdered him." Hale shrugged. He'd become a liability. The fire surged behind him, lighting the entire sanctuary with violent gold. My head spun with heat and horror. "Why come after me?" I demanded. "I was a child." "You were the loose thread," he said. "And threads unravel everything." "You sent the chocolates," I whispered. "Yes." His voice was maddeningly calm. "To your father." "Why?" "He knew more than he admitted," Hale said. "Cowardly man. He should have stayed out of it." A piece of burning ceiling crashed between us, sending sparks shooting like angry fireflies. Hale didn't flinch. He simply stepped around the debris with the ease of someone navigating their own home. "You don't get it," he said. "I didn't kill your mother." Fear did. She ran herself into exhaustion. Paranoia. She hallucinated. She drove herself into the grave. My voice shook with rage. "You're the one who made her afraid." "That's not my fault," he said gently, "if she wasn't built for this." The chapel groaned around us like a dying beast. The walls began to buckle. "We need to go," I whispered to Lorraine. But Hale stepped forward, blocking our path. "You can't leave," he said simply. "There's too much evidence in your hands. Too much in your head." Lorraine clutched my arm. "Julia, run!" Hale reached for something inside his coat. Not a weapon, not a knife. A metal canister, small familiar. A fuel accelerant. Lorraine screamed. "He's going to burn us alive." He raised it over his head, about to douse the remaining pews and trap us in a ring of fire. And then, a sound tore through the roar of flames. Glass shattering. Someone slammed into Hale from behind. He stumbled, losing his grip on the canister. It rolled across the floor and disappeared beneath the pews. I grabbed Lorraine and pulled her back as a second silhouette emerged through the smoke. Tall, broad-shouldered, but not Hale. My father. Dad. I choked, barely believing it. Charles stumbled toward me through the flames, coughing violently, one sleeve burning. He swatted at it, stamping it out as he reached us. "You need to get out, both of you," he rasped. Hale recovered quickly, turning his cold fury on my father. "Charles," he sneered, "you should have stayed dead." My father spat blood onto the floor. "Not dead yet." The two men stared each other down amid the inferno. Heat shimmered between them like a curse brought to life. "You think you can stop me now?" Hale taunted. "No," my father said, "but I can slow you down." He lunged. The two collided with a force that sent them both crashing into a row of flaming pews. Hale roared in anger, shoving him off. My father struck the ground hard, wheezing. "Julia," he yelled, "go!" But I didn't move. I couldn't. Hale towered above him, ready to finish what he'd started 18 years ago. Then another beam gave way overhead. It fell with a fiery crack, right between Hale and my father. The impact shook the entire building. A shower of sparks erupted, filling the room with a storm of burning embers. It was the only opening we had. Now my father screamed. I grabbed Lorraine's arm and dragged her toward the rear exit. Smoke blinded us, heat pressed against our backs like a wall of fire, and the world shrank to a single desperate breath after another. Behind us, I heard Hale screaming my name, wild, furious, but the flames drowned his voice as the chapel began to collapse. We stumbled through the back door into the frigid night just as the roof gave out behind us. I turned back only once long enough to see the chapel engulfed entirely, an inferno of secrets burning to ash. But through the flames in the shattered doorway, I could still see Hale's silhouette. Standing, alive, watching us escape. Smoke stung my eyes as I dragged Lorraine across the wet grass behind the burning chapel. The December wind whipped the flames sideways, turning the collapsing structure into a giant torch that painted the night sky orange. Behind us, the roof caved in with a deafening roar, sending sparks spiraling upward like dying stars. But the only sound I truly heard was my father's labored breathing. He stumbled beside me, half collapsing, with each step his arms slung over my shoulders for support. His face was streaked with soot. His hair singed, his jacket torn open where the fire had licked through the fabric. Every few seconds he let out a cough that sounded like gravel scraping through his chest. "Dad, stop talking," I begged, tightening my grip around his waist. "You're barely breathing." He shook his head, gasping. "No, keep moving. He might not be trapped. He'll come after you." Behind us, the chapel continued to burn. Flames shot out the stained glass windows, coloring the darkness with shards of blue and red. The heat radiated out in waves, warming our backs bitterly, even as the cold air bit at our faces. Lorraine stumbled, collapsing to her knees. "I can't," she croaked. I turned to help her, but Dad tugged weakly at my sleeve. "Forget me, get her away. Now." His voice cracked mid-sentence, and he buckled, hitting the ground hard. "Dad!" I screamed, falling beside him. He didn't get up. The sirens were faint at first, far away, floating through the fog. But they were coming. I could hear them growing louder, closer, cutting through the chaos of fire and wind. Footsteps sounded behind us. I spun around, dread flooding my body, expecting to see Hale's monstrous silhouette rising from the flames. But it was a firefighter sprinting toward us, shouting orders to the rest of his team. 2 more emerged behind him with hoses. "We have civilians." 2 down, 1 walking, the first one yelled. He knelt by my father, checking his pulse with swift, practiced movements. "He's alive," he told me. "Weak, but he's alive." Relief slammed into me so hard I nearly collapsed. Please help him. Hale's still in there. But before I could finish, the roof collapsed a final time, sending a plume of sparks and black smoke into the air. Flames erupted across the entire structure. No one, not even Hale, could survive that. At least, that was what I prayed. Minutes blurred. Firefighters lifted Dad onto a stretcher oxygen mask pressed to his face. Lorraine clung to another paramedic, shaking violently as he wrapped a blanket around her trembling body. The wind shifted, carrying a spray of ash across the lawn. I watched the chapel burn, feeling a mix of devastation and closure. Almost everything my mother had hidden was gone now, those files, those clues, the evidence of Hale's cruelty. But I still had the diary. I still had some of the truth. And my father. I looked at him as paramedics loaded him into the ambulance. His chest rose and fell unevenly. His hands, once steady and strong, now shook. I climbed in beside him without asking. The ambulance sped down the coastal highway, sirens piercing the darkness. I held my father's hand tightly, trying to anchor him to consciousness. His eyelids fluttered. "Julia," he rasped. "I'm here," I whispered, brushing soot from his forehead. "Just rest." But he didn't listen. He tugged weakly at my hand, urging me closer. "I should have told you years ago," he whispered, his voice fragile as thin ice. "I should have told the police. I should have told everyone." He coughed violently, and the paramedic beside us leaned in to adjust the mask. "Dad, stop," I said, tears stinging my eyes. "Save your strength." "No," he insisted hoarsely. "You need to know." He lifted a trembling hand to my cheek. "Your mother didn't die because of a stroke." My throat tightened. "I know." "No," he whispered. "There's more." The paramedic shot me a warning look. He shouldn't be talking, but Dad grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. She wasn't just scared. She wasn't just hunted. He inhaled shakily. She found something. Something about Hale. Something big. What did she find? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He struggled for breath. A file. Real evidence, not just the medication logs. Something else. She hid it. Somewhere only she knew. My pulse pounded. Where Dad? Where? He coughed again, blood speckling the inside of the mask. His eyes rolled slightly before snapping back to mine. She told me. To protect it. But I didn't. I was too scared. His voice cracked. And when Hale came after her, I walked away. I left her alone. "Dad," I choked, "please." She asked me to back her up, to go to the board with her, to tell them what she found. But I didn't. I let her fight alone. And she... He swallowed tears mixing with soot. She died alone. Because I failed her. The grief in his voice was unbearable. I leaned closer, forehead resting against his. "Tell me where the file is." His eyes drifted toward the ceiling, unfocused. Then he whispered so faintly I almost missed it. "Locker. The first one wasn't. The only one." My breath caught. "Dad. What locker? Where?" He opened his mouth. Then, flatlined. The paramedic lunged forward. "Sir!" "Stay with us!" I screamed as the team grabbed paddles, barking commands at each other. "Charge to 200. Clear Dad's body jerked violently. I clutched the wall of the ambulance, tears streaming down my face, my whole world collapsing into the rhythm of the heart monitor. Beep, beep, beep. Then silence. The paramedic cursed under his breath, charging again, clear another jolt, another lifeless slump, and then a weak, wavering beep filled the ambulance. Then another, then another. He was back. Barely, but back. The paramedic exhaled in relief, wiping sweat from his brow. "Ma'am, he'll make it to the hospital. But he's critical. Prepare yourself." I nodded numbly, gripping my father's limp hand. His fingers twitched weakly as if trying to tell me he wasn't done talking. but he slipped into unconsciousness again, leaving me with a phrase that rattled through my mind like a loose piece of bone. The first locker wasn't the only one. What did that mean? Another location. A second deposit. Another stash of evidence. Lightning flashed across the sky as we neared the hospital, illuminating the marshland and broken road signs. The storm was rolling in fast. The ambulance screeched into the emergency bay and nurses rushed to transfer Dad inside. I followed them through the glass doors, the sharp hospital smell hitting me like a memory I wasn't ready to relive. They wheeled him away and I stood alone in the hallway, soaked in rain and ash, shaking from adrenaline and heartbreak. That was when I saw her. Lorraine. She sat in a wheelchair near the nurse's station, wrapped in blankets, her face streaked with tears and soot. She looked gutted, hollowed out, but alive. "Julia," she whispered when she saw me. "I'm so sorry. For everything." I knelt beside her, taking her trembling hands in mine. "You didn't kill my mother. Hale did. He killed my daughter too," she said hoarsely. "Not with his hands, with his lies." I swallowed hard. "We're not done. Not yet." Lorraine nodded slowly. "I saw someone with him tonight. Someone smaller than Hale. The shape, the way he moved." She shivered. He wasn't alone. Her words echoed my father's. The ghost, still alive, still helping Hale. A cold dread seeped into my bones. Before I could respond, a police officer approached us. "Miss Marrow?" he asked. "Yes, we found footprints behind the chapel. 2 sets. One matched Hale's boots. He escaped the structure before it collapsed. The second belonged to an unidentified male. We believe he assisted Hale." My stomach dropped. "Do you know where he is now?" I whispered. The officer shook his head grimly. "We followed the prints toward the riverfront, but the trail ended abruptly. Whoever he is, he's smart." Lorraine's breath hitched. "He's still following us." The officer nodded. "We have officers searching the area." I stood slowly, wiping my face with trembling hands. My mother was gone. Tom was nearly dead. My father was hanging by a thread. Lorraine's daughter had been murdered by lies, and Hale, the man who started it all, was still out there. Somewhere. Watching. Waiting for the right moment to strike again. "I need to see my father," I whispered. The officer nodded and stepped aside. As I walked down the dim corridor, the truth hardened inside me like iron. My mother died alone. My father nearly died trying to save us. Lorraine lost her child to the same evil. And I wasn't going to run anymore. I was going to finish what my mother started. Even if I had to walk straight into the dark to do it. The ICU was quieter than any place had a right to be. Machines hummed in steady rhythms, beeping like distant metronomes, guiding life back into bodies that hovered on the edge. The air smelled of antiseptic and cold metal, sterile, unforgiving. I stood in the doorway of my father's room, breath caught in my throat as I watched him lying beneath white sheets, bruised and pale beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. He looked smaller somehow, shrunken, as though the fire had burned away not just the chapel, but 15 years of weight he'd carried alone. A nurse looked up from adjusting his IV. "He's conscious," she whispered. "But weak." Her voice softened when she saw my face. "Go to him. He's been asking for you." I moved slowly to his bedside, afraid that if I blinked, he'd vanish like a ghost. His eyelids flickered, then lifted. "Julia." I took his hand. "I'm here, Dad." His fingers curled weakly around mine. "Don't hate me for what I'm about to say." A tremor ran through me. My throat tightened painfully. "Just tell me." He swallowed hard breath, rattling. "The night your mother died, I was there. I saw her fear. I saw what she'd uncovered. And I walked away." My heart clenched. "Why?" "Because I was a coward," he said, eyes shining with guilt. Because I thought that if I stayed silent, Hale would leave us alone. I thought I was protecting you girls. I squeezed his hand. You couldn't have known. He shook his head, a tear slipping down his soot-streaked cheek. No, I knew enough. And that's what makes it worse. He looked toward the ceiling as if searching for courage in the sterile white tiles above him. She came home that night trembling, he said. She told me about the medication logs, the cameras, the technician. She told me Hale confronted her in the supply room, told her she was digging her own grave. She wanted me to go with her to the board the next morning to stand beside her. And you didn't, I whispered. His voice cracked. I told her to stop, to let it go. I begged her, because I was terrified. Terrified we'd lose everything. I wiped my eyes, though the tears kept falling. Dad? She left the house anyway, he continued. Without me. Alone. And that was the last time I ever saw her alive. A sob tore through my chest. He closed his eyes briefly, face contorted with pain, emotional, not physical. She didn't die from a stroke. You know that now. The hospital knew she was a problem. Hale made sure she was monitored, drugged, exhausted. And you believed the lie, I whispered. I wanted to, he breathed. Because the truth meant I'd failed her. The monitor beeped steadily beside him, each sound like a pinprick in my chest. He looked at me again, eyes bloodshot and full of regret. You have to understand, he said. I loved her, but I wasn't strong enough to stand against that man. I leaned closer. Dad, whatever you're about to tell me now. Don't hold back. His gaze drifted toward the window as if seeing years of memories float by. After she died, he said slowly, I found a file she left for me, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in our bedroom. I thought it would go away if I ignored it. But Hale didn't. He sent me threats, showed up at my work, made sure I knew he was watching. My breath trembled. What was in the file? The truth, he said, voice faint. Real evidence. The kind that could have exposed him. The kind that could have destroyed him. Where is it now? I asked, heart racing. He opened his mouth, but a sudden fit of coughing racked his body. The nurse rushed in to adjust his oxygen mask. When the episode passed, he was shaking breath shallow. Dad, I pleaded, where is the file? The one Mom left. His hand lifted trembling and he pointed weakly toward the nightstand. In there, he whispered. I yanked open the drawer. Inside was a sealed envelope, old yellowed at the edges. My name was written on the front in my father's uneven handwriting. Before the chapel, he said, voice barely audible, I brought it with me. I was going to give it to you. But Hale... He got there first. I returned to his side. Dad, the envelope is here. But you said there was more. You said the first locker wasn't the only one. He nodded, sweat beading along his hairline. Your mother... She made copies. She didn't trust anyone. Not even me. Where I whispered. His eyes locked onto mine. There's a second location. A second locker, she told Evelyn. Not me. My breath faltered. Evelyn. He nodded, eyes fluttering. Find her. She knows where it is. The weight of that revelation sank deep into my bones. The truth wasn't gone. Not all of it. And Hale wasn't done trying to bury it. Dad's voice weakened further and he gripped my hand with surprising strength. I don't deserve your forgiveness, he said. I know that. I shook my head fiercely. I forgave you a long time ago. I just didn't know it yet. He smiled faintly, eyes glassy. You're stronger than she ever knew. The monitor's beeping slowed. His breaths grew shallower. Dad, stay with me, I whispered, panic clawing at my throat. He touched my cheek. Tell your mother. I'm sorry. His hand fell away. The monitor alarm blared. A team of nurses and doctors rushed in, pushing me aside. I stood in the corner, trembling violently, watching them fight to bring him back. Charge to 200 clear. His body jerked. The line on the screen wavered. Again clear, another jolt, another waver. Then slowly the beeping steadied. I crumpled into a chair, sobbing with relief. Minutes passed before a doctor approached me. "He's stable for now," she said. "But he needs rest. He's very weak." I nodded numbly, wiping tears with trembling fingers. As the doctor walked away, a police officer stepped into the doorway. "Miss Marrow," he said, "we need to talk." I stood gripping the envelope in my hand. "What now?" "We found something near the riverfront," he said. "Footprints from 2 men. One is confirmed to be Hale. The other, smaller build. Fast. Careful. Whoever he is, he knows how to avoid cameras." "The ghost," I whispered. The officer nodded grimly. "He helped Hale escape." My heart sank. "So he's still out there?" "Yes," the officer said, "and we have reason to believe he's watching the hospital." A chill raced through me. "Do you want an escort home?" he asked. I shook my head. "I'm not going home." "Then where are you going?" I looked down at the envelope in my hands, at the evidence my mother died to protect, and the truth my father nearly died to give me. "I'm going to finish this," I said. The officer studied me for a long moment before nodding. "Just be careful." When he left, I sat in the hallway alone, the envelope heavy in my lap. Inside was everything my mother had wanted me to know. But Evelyn had the rest, and Hale wasn't giving up. Not yet. I wiped my eyes, squared my shoulders, and rose to my feet. My mother's truth was still alive, and I was done being afraid of the dark. A week after the chapel fire, the world felt strangely quiet, as if the air itself were catching its breath. The chaos, the fear, the running, it all fell away the moment I stepped into my father's ICU room. Winter light spilled through the blinds, softening the sharp lines on his face. He looked pale, but alive, and alive was enough. He opened his eyes when he heard me. "Julia?" "I'm here," I said, sitting beside him. "You scared me." He managed a faint smile. "I scared myself." I took his hand gently, careful not to disturb the IV taped to his skin. "The doctors say you're getting stronger. They lie beautifully," he murmured. "But I'll take it." A small laugh escaped me, thin, watery, but real. I hadn't heard myself laugh in weeks. He squeezed my hand. "Did you find what she left?" "The real truth? I'm close," I said. "Evelyn is meeting me today." His eyes softened. "Good." Margaret trusted her. I swallowed the tightness in my throat and leaned back as the room settled into silence. For the first time in years, we were no longer orbiting the weight of unspoken things, we were finally facing them. Later that afternoon, I met Evelyn in the hospital garden where winter bare trees cast long shadows across the stone paths. She sat on a bench wrapped in a thick scarf, her hands cupped around a steaming paper cup. "You look tired," she said gently when I sat beside her. "I am," I admitted, "but I'm ready." She nodded, reached into her bag, and pulled out another envelope, older, more weathered than the one my mother left me. "Your mother gave this to me 2 days before she died," Evelyn said. "She told me to keep it safe until you came looking. Why didn't she give it to Dad?" "Because she knew he was scared," Evelyn said softly. "And she knew you wouldn't be. Not forever." I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a USB drive, several photocopies of legal documents, and a letter in my mother's handwriting. "Julia, if you're holding this, you were brave enough to search. This is the file I couldn't give the board. This is what Hale feared most." My heart raced as I read line after line describing falsified reports, unauthorized drug orders, secret meetings between Hale and hospital executives, and at the bottom in shaky hand, "If justice can't come for me, let it come through you. Love, Mom." I pressed the letter to my chest, tears slipping silently down my cheeks. "She trusted you," I whispered. "She trusted you more," Evelyn corrected. "She always said you had her fire." Wind stirred the remaining leaves around our feet. For the first time since my mother's death, I felt grounded, anchored in something stronger than fear. "I'm going to take this to the police," I said. Evelyn nodded. "It's time." Detective Ramos met me in a small interrogation-style room that felt far too cold for comfort. He studied each document with sharp, calculating eyes. When he plugged in the USB and watched the video file, my mother trembling, whispering about being threatened, his expression hardened. "This is enough," he said. "More than enough." He closed the folder and looked at me. "Witnesses have come forward since the chapel fire. A former technician, Hale's ghost, left town years ago, but resurfaced last week terrified. He's willing to testify." Relief washed through me in waves so intense my legs weakened. "And Hale?" I asked. "We're close," Ramos said. "Very close." I nodded. It was finally happening. My mother's truth was no longer buried beneath fear and silence. It was coming to the surface, roaring like a storm. As I left the station, a weight lifted from my chest, one I'd carried for most of my life. A year passed, a full year of hearings, testimonies, interviews, statements. Hale was arrested with overwhelming evidence against him. The ghost, the technician, took a plea deal in exchange for unraveling Hale's web of manipulation. The hospital launched a full internal investigation that rippled through Charleston's entire medical community. The truth my mother died for finally had a voice. But the healing that came slower. On Christmas Eve, the world smelled of pine needles and cinnamon. I stood in my sister's living room watching Emma hang a shiny red ornament on the tree, while Hannah guided her small hands. "Don't drop it, sweetheart," Hannah said. Emma giggled. "It's okay if I drop it. Aunt Julia can fix anything." I smiled at that. Maybe I couldn't fix everything, but I'd fixed enough. Dad shuffled into the room wearing a thick sweater, moving slower these days, but smiling more. "It looks beautiful," he said, admiring the tree. "We saved you a spot," I teased, handing him a handmade wooden ornament. He placed it carefully near the center of the tree, a simple circle with MM carved into it. Mom's initials. His eyes softened and he whispered, "Merry Christmas, Margaret." We spent the evening with hot cocoa and quiet laughter, the kind that comes only from a family that nearly lost everything but found its way back. Later that night, after the house grew still, I sat alone in front of the tree. The lights blinked softly, reflecting off the ornaments. My mother's diary rested on my lap, the pages worn but cherished. I whispered, "We did it, Mom." Outside, snowflakes began to drift their soft descent, painting the world white. For the first time since she died, I felt at peace. And if you're still here with me listening to this story unfold, I want to say something from my heart. If you've ever carried a family secret, or lived buried under someone else's lies, if you've ever tried to heal from something you didn't deserve, or if you've ever lost someone to silence, I hope my journey reminded you that truth is worth fighting for. Tell me in the comments, have you ever uncovered something hidden in your family, or forgiven someone who hurt you deeply? I'd love to hear your story. And if you want more stories about real pain, real justice, and real healing, stay with me on this channel. Like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Sometimes the truth sleeps for years, but when it wakes, it can set you free.